All right, today we're diving into one of the weirdest, most fascinating books you'll probably ever hear about. It's called Flatland, A Romance of Many Dimensions, and it was published way back in 1884. Now, get this, the author is listed as a square. And yeah, you heard that right. Our narrator for this whole adventure is a literal, actual square.
So let me start by asking you a question. What if your entire universe, everything you see, everything you are, was confined to a totally flat sheet of paper? You could move forwards, backwards, left, right, but up and down? Those words wouldn't even be in your vocabulary. They just wouldn't exist.
Well, that's exactly the world our guide, a square, lives in. It's a place called Flatland, and it's filled to the brim with geometric shapes just living their lives on this enormous two-dimensional plane.
Just picture it. You've got lines, triangles, squares, and all sorts of polygons gliding around. But there's one huge, unbreakable rule in their world. They can't rise above the surface or sink below it. They are completely and utterly flat.
Now for us, who A-Square calls residents of Spaceland, it's easy, right? We have this privileged three-dimensional view. We can just look down and see everything. We can tell the pointy soldier triangles from the respectable squares and the high-class circles. It's kind of like having a God's eye view.
But what's it actually like for them, living inside Flatland? The book has this great way of helping us imagine it. Think about a coin sitting on a table. From above, it's obviously a circle. But what happens as you lower your eye down, down, down to the level of the table? The circle looks like it's getting squashed, right?
And that's the big reveal. That's the problem at the heart of their perception. When your entire existence is on that flat plane, that coin, that triangle, even a fancy many-sided polygon, it all just looks like a straight line. Everybody and everything looks the same.
Which, of course, brings up a pretty big question. If everyone you meet just looks like a line segment, how in the world do you recognize anyone? How do you know if you're talking to a low-class worker or a super important priest? Well, the answer to that question reveals the incredibly bizarre social structure of Flatland.
Oh yeah, welcome to the social ladder of Flatland. It's maybe the most rigid class system you could possibly imagine. At the very bottom, you have the women, who are literally just straight lines. Then you've got the workers and soldiers. They're sharp isosceles triangles. From there, the more sides you have, the higher your status. You work your way up through squares and pentagons, all the way to the nobility, who are these complex polygons. And at the very tippy top, the priests. They're perfect circles. Oh, and here's the best part. There's a law of nature that says every son is born with one more side than his dad. Now that's what I call social climbing.
So the book is using this whole geometric society as a brilliant satire of its own Victorian era. Take the women, for example. As straight lines, they're seen as having no brains, but they are also considered incredibly dangerous. You see, if a woman turns to face you head-on, she becomes a single invisible point. And as A-Square says, running into one means absolute and immediate destruction, a walking, talking needle.
So our buddy A-Square is just going about his business, totally accepting his 2D world, when one night he has a dream. He visits a universe that's even more confined than his own, a one-dimensional reality he calls Lineland. Now, in Lineland, the inhabitants are just points and tiny little lines, all living on one single infinite line. They can only move forward and backward. The idea of moving sideways is completely unthinkable. To a Linelander, the entire universe is just a single point, because that's all they can ever see right in front of them. And this leads to this absolutely hilarious and kind of frustrating conversation. A-Square, coming from his superior two-dimensional world, tries to explain the idea of moving left or right to the king of Lineland. And the king, he just can't get it. How can you move in a direction that literally doesn't exist? He just thinks A-Square is totally insane. Now, remember that reaction. It's about to get real ironic.
Because just like our square could look down on the one-dimensional world of Lineland, well, someone from a three-dimensional world can look down on him. And soon after his dream, A-Square gets a visitor, a being from Spaceland, a sphere.
Okay, quick geometry refresh here to understand what happens next. A cross-section is the 2D slice you see when a 3D object passes through a 2D surface. You know, like if you pushed a carrot through a sheet of paper, the shape you'd see on the paper would be a circle. That's its cross-section. So when this sphere from Spaceland decides to pop into Flatland, this is what A-Square sees. First, a tiny point just appears out of thin air. Then that point grows into a small circle. That circle gets bigger, and bigger, until it hits its maximum size, and then it starts shrinking back down to a point before vanishing completely. For a Flatlander, this is pure magic. It's an impossible miracle.
The sphere then does something even crazier. It physically lifts A square up out of the plane of Flatland and shows him the mind-blowing reality of a third dimension, the concept of height. So when our newly enlightened square comes back home, he's so excited. He wants to preach the gospel of upward, not northward. But yeah, it's not exactly met with a standing ovation.
Actually, it goes so badly that A square gets arrested for the crime of preaching about a third dimension. He's thrown in prison, and he stays there for 7 long years, trying to convince anyone at all, of the truth that he's seen.
And this quote from the Chief Circle, the leader of Flatland, just perfectly sums up the problem. He says, basically, "Oh, you say I have height? Fine, show it to me, measure it. But how can you possibly measure or even point to a dimension that no one in your world can perceive? It's an impossible task, and A square's incredible revelation gets dismissed as pure craziness." And this is where the book turns its brilliant idea around and points it directly at us, the readers. We've been having a good chuckle at the poor limited landliners and Flatlanders, but the real question is, are we any different? You don't even have to guess. This is from the book's actual dedication. The author's whole point wasn't just to tell a clever story about shapes. It was to get us, the so-called inhabitants of space, to wonder about the possibility of dimensions beyond our own limited 3. The pattern is just crystal clear when you lay it out like this. The king of one dimension can't even imagine a second. The society of 2 dimensions literally locks up the guy who suggests a third. Each one is a prisoner of their own perspective. And then A square, from his prison cell, just drops his absolute bombshell. He looks right at us and says, our reaction to someone talking about a 4th dimension would be exactly the same as his society's reaction to the 3rd. We would call it madness. We would lock up the prophet. And that's the question the book leaves us chewing on. It's so much more than a geometry lesson. It's a sharp, witty story about humility, about being open to ideas that seem impossible, and about the limits of our own perception. It really forces you to ask, are we so sure that our 3 dimensions are all there is? Or could we, just like the shapes in Flatland, be completely blind to a whole other reality, just 1 dimension away?